Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Thursday's lecture. Today, as you can see, we have a background. Thank you to Miss Sydney Ward for sending us her little friend named Teddy, if I remember correctly. If you also have some pets or any other background that you want to share with me, I'll be more than happy to do that. Just send them along and we can do that. So thanks for that. Now, let's start our topic today. We will complete the discussion about material theories, talking a little bit more about aspects of neorealism, then talk about a new material theory, and finish with a discussion about the public view of those different theoretical approaches. First, as always, a quick review. So on Tuesday, I began the discussion about the material theories. Those theories reside in the system level of analysis, focusing on the effects of the system itself, the condition within the system, and how that affects the behavior of different countries. We talked about the classic realist theory, the 6 different core principles, mostly revolving around the concepts of power. Each state pursues, first and foremost, its interest as defined within the context of power. That creates a balance of power, a global international system. And the example that I talked about the most was the multipolar system that has characterized the European nations from the late 17th century all the way through World War I on that some combination of the other, but overall it was defined as a multipolar system, again, revolving around the concept of power and the way that actors behave. Then I talked about the neorealist theory, the newer version of the classic realism as presented by Wolff in the late 1970s. This is defined as a reductionist structural theory, places much more emphasis on the structure itself and how the conditions and the way that the structure is built affects the behavior of the different elements, the states. The focus of the theory, of course, was on security, not power. So states are trying to maximize their own security, not necessarily their power. All this is based on the structure of the system, which is defined as an anarchy. So there's no one central government which oversees all the interactions between the different nations in the system, which means it's much harder to enforce any kind of agreement between nations, which essentially means that every nation has to take care of itself. And that's the anarchy. That means that we have to take care of ourselves for our own security. And the system structure in this case is usually the bipolar world, such as that we have during the Cold War, with the US on the one hand, the Soviet Union on the other hand, and each one of those poles have their own share of nations. Those are the two main material theories. If you have any questions on everything that we talked about during Tuesday's lecture, please email them to me or join me on office hours. As you know, they are open to all of you, and I hope you'll decide to join at some point. All right, so today, as I said, we continue the discussion about the material theories with 2 different theories. I want to talk about a critical aspect related to neorealism, but first a quick review on the main points of realism in order to make sure that we're on the same page. So as I said, an advanced version of classic realism, focusing on the international system as structuring the behavior of the states, has a set of simplifying assumptions, which I talked about, and here they are again, intended to make it easier to represent the international system. Those assumptions also provide us with a theory, present more general, much more parsimonious, so very simple in its explanation, and that comes at the expense of accuracy. So it's not the most accurate theory, but it's much more simpler and it covers a lot more cases. And the assumption, as I talked about on Tuesday, and that's just, again, just a quick review, the anarchy, which leads every nation to believe that it has to take care of itself, self-help. States are the primary actors. Every state in the international system focuses on maximizing its own security. That's the #1 thing that those states are trying to accomplish. Everything comes afterwards. It will pursue additional power as long as it does not represent additional risk. So that's a quick review on neorealism, and the reason I do that because I want to talk today in the first part of the lecture about an important element that rises from those different assumptions, from those different conditions, and that is called the security dilemma. So at the top, as you can see, is the definition as offered by Robert Jervis in the late 1970s, the means by which a state tries to increase its own security actually decreases the security of others. Now, this seems a pretty trivial definition, but think about it in a strategic sense. If every state will try to increase its own security, that at the same time lead other states to see themselves as less secure because the others extended their own security. That means that does everyone get in a better situation because of it? Not necessarily. It is possible that none of the states actually increase their own security when they all behave in that same way. The idea behind the security dilemma is that when one nation attempts to pursue more influence, to pursue more security, it triggers a reaction, a concern from their adversary, which are worried for their own security. Those other nations are more likely to respond by balancing the behavior of the first state, in this case, form an alliance or engage in additional buildup of their own forces. And again, that creates this dynamic. Now, why is this seen as a dilemma? Again, think about it from the context of the states that initiates this entire dynamic. I'm trying to expand in order to what I view as taking care of my own security, but at the same time, I know that by expanding my own security, I'm actually harming the security of other nations, which in the long run can also harm my own security. So that figures, in this case, a dilemma. There are two key themes when we discuss the security dilemma. First of all, it is seen as a fundamental aspect of us understanding how is this possible that within an anarchic system, when actors behave and have the similar objective, they actually might eventually end up in a conflict. So all of them two actors in this case have the same objective of maximizing their own security, but actually eventually they end up in a conflict. It's a rational foundation for what's called the spiral model, in which case two actors are trying to maximize their own security, but at the same time, they're actually only fueling their own competition and escalate their relationships because they might feel this dilemma due to their own insecurity. Another important aspect in this case is the offensive-defensive balance, as I talked about on Tuesday, and I'll get to that later today. And that's the balance between those two types of capability, as well as the differentiation. There are two main types of actions that states are engaged in that might trigger this insecurity, might lead to extending or escalating the security dilemma, and eventually might lead to conflict and for both states to be worse off. The first one is engaging in arms race. So it makes sense that increasing my own arms will make my rival feel less powerful. That's going to trigger and create incentives for this rival to either arm himself or to balance in any other way, for example, joining an alliance. So again, by increasing my own military capabilities, I'm making my rival become less powerful, and I'm creating incentives for that rival to arm also and overall create less secure environment. If we add here the offensive-defensive balance logic, it also has an effect on the extent of insecurity that I'm feeling, because an increase in the offensive power, which is matched by my adversary, so arms race which involved offensive capabilities, makes me stronger. My adversary also engage in arms race of offensive capabilities. It makes him stronger as well. But overall, both of us are less capable to defend ourselves. So overall, this situation is less secure. So that's triggering insecurity because of expansion of offensive arms. At the same time, if both of us are adding defensive capabilities, we increase our own defensive our capabilities to defend ourselves, which overall creates some form of insecurity, but not to the same level as increases in offensive capabilities. What's also important here, before getting to the point of the signaling intentions, is that the size of the increasing power, as well as the type of the power that I'm deciding to engage in an arms race, also matters. Because if I'm deciding to increase my ground forces, that actually enhance both my defensive capabilities as well as my actor's defensive capabilities. My adversary, if he engages in the same type of action. If I decide to engage in an arms race which involves more nuclear weapons, that actually represents a more escalatory dynamic, because that makes stronger retaliation capabilities that I'm going to have, and then my adversary is going to engage in the same type of behavior, both of us will have stronger retaliation capabilities, and which was going to make the situation much more likely to go into escalation and possibly war. And that's another way to view how arms race leads to greater insecurity. Now to the idea of signaling motives. When I'm deciding to engage in an arms race, I have to think about how is the adversary views me. It is possible that my decision to build up my military forces is going to make my adversary view me as, it's going to lead my adversary to change her own beliefs about what are my intentions. So instead of viewing my intentions as the way that I see them, they might see my intentions as being what is called a greedy behavior. So my intentions in my buildup of military capabilities is beyond just making sure that I got my own security. And that might be a problem, which again is going to lead to further insecurity. So the type of actions that I'm deciding to pursue is going to matter for the way that the adversary views my intentions, which means if I'm deciding to increase my own military capabilities beyond the needs of territory defense, it's more likely to be viewed by my adversary as a greedy behavior. At the same time, the type of force that I'm deciding to expand also matters. If I'm deciding mostly to engage in offensive capabilities arms race, I'm more likely to be seen as a greedy state than a non-greedy state if I'm engaging in a defensive capability enhancement. The second type of action that might lead to greater insecurity is a decision by me to build up my military forces. It's going to make the enemy it's going to make my adversary less secure, and in response, he will decide to explore the idea of territorial expansion, and that is intended mostly to compensate for the loss in security. That might mean more resources by getting more territory, having more strategic depth, having much more secure borders. So all that might be a response by my adversary to my buildup of forces, of my expansion of my security, the way I see that, and overall to decrease in the extent of security in our actions. And that's part of the security dilemma. In this case, as an example, this is part of the dynamic that happened in Europe with the expansion of NATO into some of the countries in Central Europe and then Eastern Europe, especially when you think about it from the context of Russia, the way that Russia viewed those kinds of actions. So that's also part of it. Now, I talked a little bit before about the signaling of intentions. I want to get back to that for a minute now, talking about misperceptions in the context of the security dilemma. So the way that my actions are viewed by my adversary matter for how likely it is that the security dilemma is going to be severe and leads to these kinds of escalations. The problem is that in most cases, a lot of the leaders will assume that the way that I have my intentions are going to be viewed by my adversary the same way that I intend them to be. So if I'm deciding to engage in a military buildup in order to enhance my own security, I assume that my adversary is going to view my actions the same. But in many cases, this is a very, very an erroneous assumption, because it's more likely than not than that my adversary will actually view my behavior as we called about earlier, greedy, and will actually engage in her own spiral, in her own military buildup. That's going to create a spiral escalation and increase the likelihood of conflict. So overall, it's just the wrong interpretation of arms increases by my adversary is going to lead to this kind of escalation. And that begins from my wrong assumption that my adversary is going to realize that I'm doing those kinds of military arms increases in order to extend my own security, which in this case is not the correct way to think about it. I want to talk quickly about a quick example, a historical example to explain this dynamic of the security dilemma. So this is the Middle East, part of it at least. Israel, over here on the northeast of Israel is Syria. On the east of Israel is Jordan, and on the west and southwest of Israel, in this case, is Egypt. In the late 1950s, the leaders of Egypt and Syria has came to an agreement to form what was called the UAR, the United Arab Republic. So it was a joint commitment between both countries to, it was some form of a defense agreement between the both countries in order to ensure their own security faces what they viewed as aggression and tensions on the part of Israel. So the story I want to talk about is in the late 1950s, there was a rising tensions and a lot of border conflicts between Israel and Syria here on the northeast border of Israel, which led to a mobilization of Israeli forces towards that border, again, in the late 1959, early 1960. As part of this agreement between Egypt and Syria, the Egyptian responded in early 1960, in February of 1960, by being very concerned about the Israeli actions in close to the Syrian border and moving their own military forces from the areas here in Egypt into the Sinai Peninsula, which was partially demilitarized since the war in 1956. The Egyptian military has came pretty close to the south border of Israel here, and Israel, in response, which was caught not ready for this action by the Egyptian military, responded by sending its own military forces towards the southern border, and both militaries stood one against another in late February 1960. And that's exactly this dynamic of the security dilemma. So Israel engaged in her own, increasing her own security by taking some actions against the Syrians in the north. The Egyptian felt less secure because of this dynamic between Israel and Syria and the commitment that they had to Syria. So they responded by sending their own military forces towards the Israeli border in order to signal to Israel that they have to withdraw. Israel, of course, had to respond to these actions by the Egyptians and send their own military down to the southern border of Israel. And both militaries stood very close here to the southern border of Israel, very close to a direct military conflict in the beginning of 1960. The crisis eventually was diffused. Israel did only a partial mobilization, which already was a signal of unwillingness to go into a wide-scale conflict. There was also discussions within a diplomatic solution with the UN. Eventually, Egypt decided to diffuse the conflict, the crisis, by de-escalating and pull its military back to the Egyptian area, and the crisis was resolved in early March of 1960. But again, this is just an example how this dilemma, how this dynamic of relationship between countries that are only trying to take care of their own security, if you think about it in the context of the neorealist theory, might actually lead to what's called the spiral escalation and the probability of conflict. The last point in this context is trying to link together the security dilemma and the offensive and defensive balance into the neorealist approach. So when the defensive capability dominates, then arms races, which trigger the security dilemma, it might lead to war, are less likely, and stability is much more certain. At the same time, and I've already talked about that, when offensive capabilities are the dominant part of the arms race, then arms races will expand by all the members of the system. And there are a few conditions in this case, and this is the conditions here that you can see on your screen, which makes war much more likely. So if war is viewed by some of the members of the system as probably a quick war and profitable, mostly because the dominance of the offensive capabilities, then again, the likelihood of war is much greater. The same point about the expansion. And if a nation has a fair strike advantage and has higher and larger offensive capabilities, then this nation is more likely to engage also in a preemptive action and increase the likelihood of war. An example for that is the origins of the First World War and with respect to the German expansion and having the first strike capabilities back at the time. So they had the dominance of the offensive capabilities. They had the first strike capabilities versus the French and the Russians at the time. And that's part of the explanations for the beginning of World War I back in the beginning of the 20th century, almost the beginning. All right, so finishing up on neorealism, I wanted to just have one slide that's gonna put together all the different limitations of this theory. I talked a lot about them in different slides throughout today and on Tuesday. So I just put everything together into one list so we can just make sure that we are on the same page here. So some of the challenges that the neorealist theory approaches: by design, this is a very abstract theory, which offers a lot of benefits, as I talked about in before, but also represents a challenge because it ignores a lot of the inner workings of the different components of the system of the state. It ignores a lot of the details, so its explanatory part might be limited on some senses. It also ignores lower level interactions or conflicts. So think about all the proxy wars that I talked about on Tuesday that happened during the Cold War, whether it was in Vietnam, whether it was other nations in East Asia, whether it was in the Middle East or in Africa. Most of those interactions, most of those conflicts are underplayed when we think about it in the context of neorealism, because the focus is the confrontation between the great powers of the system. And since there is no direct conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, it matters much less. The neorealist approach, of course, emphasizes the survival of nations above everything, and survival is important, but it is not the only interest of state in the international system. So this is a limitation in some cases when we think about explaining the behavior of state. We'll go into much more detail next week when we talk about other theories, when we try to present other different interests that states have in the international system. We also have a few challenges which are specific to the security dilemma itself. First is some inconsistency in the fit of the dilemma within the neorealist approach, because if we follow the neorealist assumptions that we assume a system in which all states trying to maximize their own security, then how it is possible that, according to the security dilemma, some of the state might misinterpret the objective of others? How is it possible that by me taking action in order to ensure my own security, if that means for that case an arms buildup, my adversary might misinterpret my behavior and view it actually as an aggressive action, and that might lead to the entire spiral dynamics I talked about earlier. So that's kind of a contrast that the security dilemma represents to some of the ideas behind neorealism. It means that overall that uncertainty is a much more powerful than neorealism allows it on some level. The dilemma is real, and is real with respect to multiple motives that the states may have. The second challenge in this case is to what it's related to one school of thought within a neorealist approach, and that's the offensive realist school. So neorealism, by its basic definition, is fitting more to, as I talked about on Tuesday, so what's called a defensive realism. The offensive realist approach, according to this approach, states are maximizing their relative military powers in order to ensure their own security. So they're still trying to maximize security, but they do that by enhancing their relative military power. That's the idea of an offensive realist school of thought. The problem is that this kind of an approach ignores the strategic aspect of the security dilemma, because everything that I talked about so far in those almost 25 minutes of discussion is that by expanding my own military capabilities, I'm actually triggering the security dilemma and overall leading to less security. So how does that fit together? That's part of the problem, again, that the security dilemma, along with several of the aspects of the neorealist approach, create a problem in this sense. Okay, let's move forward. Now we're going to talk about another material theory. This theory explains also interactions between powerful states in the international system, and details about the conditions for war and peace. This theory is called the power transition theory, or PTT in short. It was proposed by a scholar named Organsky back in 1958. It shares several aspects with the realist approach, most notably the importance of power, but it also has other aspects which are important to it. The power transition theory focuses on the strongest states in the system and their interactions. It draws implications from the interactions of those different systems to explain why and how war is more likely. It also cares very much about maintaining the structure of the international system or changes in the international system. So again, the structure also matters. That's why this theory also is one of the central structural theories. Now, power, as I said, is a concept that it matters a lot for power transition theory. That's what it shares with realism. At the same time, this theory places a lot of value on the status quo. The status quo is the general pattern of diplomatic, economic, military interactions between members of the global system. I will expand about it a little bit more in a few minutes, but the status quo is another concept which is on some level almost as important as power within the power transition theory. Power transition theory defines a dominant state. The dominant state is the one that establishes the order, and the order is the rules that direct the interactions in the sense of political, economic, military, diplomatic, all kinds of interaction between members of the system. This control over the rules of the system is a very important aspect of power transition theory, because by having the ability to set those rules, the state is the most dominant state in the system. And the reason that the state establishes this order and maintains those kinds of rules over the system is because it draws benefits from it. So again, while power and security are important concepts and factors within this theory, the focus is the control over the rules of the system or the norms of the international system. This is the focus of this theory. And the question is, how exactly does power transition theory explain interactions between different actors in the global system? So for that, we have to talk to a few points. Also think about the differences with the realist theory. So the structure that the theory presents is not an anarchy, but actually a hierarchy. The hierarchy which consists of several clusters of states. So the most powerful and influential state is one cluster, that's the top category, and that's the smallest in size. So we have a very small number of states which are in this top category. They're the most powerful and the most influential. The largest category is small states, which have few resources and low influence. Examples for that, think about in the context of this theory, which again was presented in the 1960s, is countries such as Laos or Thailand back in the in East Asia, sorry, or some of the countries in Africa. They are countries that fit within the smaller state category of this hierarchy. And there's middle powers, which have some influence, include countries such as Pakistan or the Netherlands. So those are the middle powers. This is the middle category in this hierarchy. Now, how do we understand the sources for the great powers or the dominant state? This is the economic and the military power. That's the foundations for the dominant state in the system. This is a combination of factors, including the national wealth, can be the GDP, that just can be the overwhelming military power that some states have. Another important aspect of power transition theory is the concept of satisfied or dissatisfied states. This is also fitting with another theory, very, very close to that. I'm not going to talk about that. It's called the hegemonic stability theory. And that's very close to the power transition theory. We're going to talk about, but we're not going to talk about that today. The idea behind the satisfied or dissatisfied state is that some states are satisfied with the structure of the international system. The vast majority of states are not satisfied, but are not satisfied with the structure of the international system. But, and that's where the last point that you see here on the slide fits, they don't have the capabilities to actually do something about it. So that's one of the places, another one of the places where the power transition theory deviates from realism, because some states may have a lot of power, but they are still satisfied from the structure of the international system, so they will not engage in any attempts to try the system. There's not going to be likelihood of war in this case. And they are satisfied with the status quo. Now, the dissatisfied actors are not satisfied with the status quo, but only the ones that have enough power, which are in the upper tier, actually represent a threat to the international peace and stability. if this actors has the tools, and in this case, this is where the relative power kicks in. If they have the tools, then this actor is going to try to change the order and rise to the top and be the dominant state. A few more pointers about the relative power concept. So the power of a state is determined by its internal growth. And those internal growth leads to constant changes of the relative power of states. If a state will grow and be strong enough to be close or almost equal to the most dominant power in the international system, then the risk of war in this case depends whether this country is satisfied or dissatisfied with the existing order. Now, a system transforming conflict is more likely when a dissatisfied power has enough, a dissatisfied state has enough power to challenge the existing order. Because the idea behind this kind of war is to change the order of the international system, it's actually a change in the rules of the game, then this war is likely to be very, very costly. And a victory by the challenging power in this case, not the dominant power, but the challenging power, if that's going to win the war, will likely lead to changes in the order of the global system. So all the rules that I talked about that are set by the dominant state are going to be changed due to a win by the challenger. Coming back again, I'll reiterate again. I'm not sure that was described clearly. The importance of the combination of not just power, but also satisfaction from the international system. So a state might be powerful enough to challenge the dominant state in the system, but if this state is satisfied with the status quo, the way that the system is right now, the order at the moment, it will not actually challenge the status quo and it will remain satisfied. So that means that having a lot of power is not enough in order to change or to change your behavior within the international system. So let's talk about an example for a dominant state and that faces challenges. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the United States. And I want to talk about the United States as a dominant power in the system. Following the Second World War, the US has emerged as a dominant power, established most of the different rules and the institutions that are intended to promote her own interests. Those included economic rules and norms. For example, the Bretton Woods Agreement was a currency regime led by the United States. The Bretton Woods Agreement made the US dollar the main currency standard that other countries are valued against, which essentially made the US dollar the most powerful currency in the global exchange and world markets, and placed the US at the center of the global economy. For example, in this case, crude oil, which was a central commodity, especially after the Second World War, was traded based on US dollars. So that means that the United States as an economic system is at the center of the global economic system. It also pushed for the establishment of international global institutions such as the GATT, which was the prequel to the World Trade Organization, the WTO. Overall, it promoted a global market economy and free trade. So those are the norms in the economic category, which the US pushed for as the dominant state in the system. From a political standpoint, it pushed for the establishment of democratic institutions, democratic states, and securing human rights. From a military and security standpoint, it pushed for the establishment of NATO, the use of limited military intervention, and especially pushing as much as possible for a UN backing for any kind of military intervention during those years. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the conditions for war based on power transition theory. So the idea again is the combination of the satisfaction or dissatisfaction along with relative power. So a dissatisfied nation, when it gains enough power to challenge the status quo, then a conflict is more likely. Since such conflict represents a challenge to the order of the international system, then of course the war is likely to be costly because it's potentially altering the system. Now, when both rivals, in this case, the dominant power and its challenger, are just about equal in their relative power, then again, the war is much more likely. And this time period is called the power transition period because the transition of power moves from the dominant state to its challenger, or maybe not, depending on the war. And this condition for war explains one of the main differences with the realist balance of power concept, because according to the realist framework, the realist theory, balance of power is intended to prevent the prospects of war because nations are balancing against one another and thus reducing the likelihood of conflict, because that keeps the system, according to the realist point of view, much more stable. At the same time, in the view of the power transition theory, because a balance of power represents, places the major actors in the system in almost equal footing. So again, so you have multiple actors in the system which are almost has the same level of powers and same level of capabilities. If one or more than one of them are also dissatisfied nation, then the likelihood of war based on the logic of power transition theory is much higher. So again, this is one of the ways in which the realist balance of power does not lead to stability under the logic of power transition theory. There are two conditions which makes a war on that type of war, of what's called the system altering war, less likely. So one of them is that the dominant power does not wait for the power transition period to begin. It will actually preempt this kind of risk and will attack the weaker state to challenge that is likely to challenge it. So that's going to be also some kind of conflict which is described by the power transition theory, but this is not the costly war which might happen when both of those nations are almost equal. Another reason why a large-scale war will not happen, and actually it's going to lead to a lower-scale war in this case, is when the emerging power, the rising power, will decide to delay the conflict, but it's not going to feel that it has enough relative power in order to challenge the status quo. So that's going to wait. That's actually going to delay the war at some point. That might lead to the first point in this discussion about preemptive attack by a dominant power, or just to the no war eventually. So some empirical evidence for the power transition theory. So one example that was given in the past is the way that Germany behaved coming into the Second World War and the Second World War itself. So Germany was an unsuccessful challenger because Germany eventually lost the war, but the conditions that led Germany to initiate the war fit with the power transition theory. The Nazi Germany wanted to change the order of the international system. They gained enough power in order to challenge the existing order led by the British and the French in that sense, and the war started. Eventually, it did not lead to a German victory and a change of the system, but this is some form of empirical evidence, at least to the power transition, getting into the power transition period. Also, there's some similarity between some of the arguments of power transition theory and the U.S. and the United Kingdom relationship at the end of the 19th century, as the U.S. has risen to become a global power, but because of other conditions which don't necessarily fit with the power transition theory, it did not materialize, and there wasn't actual direct confrontation between the United States and Great Britain. With some studies have used specific measures in order to demonstrate that the likelihood of war is actually higher when those two kinds of dominant states clashing. So one of them is looking at indicators such as the alliance portfolio gaps. So when there's asymmetry between the dominant states and the challenger in terms of its types of states that they have in their own alliance, might suggest different views of the global order, and that might mean war. So if one state, the dominant state, has some nations within its alliance portfolio, and the challenger has other states which have a different point of view of the international system, that might predict war in the future. A more direct way to measure that is looking at military expenditure. So when the challenger has substantial military expenditure, that might lead eventually to power parity, and those conditions might indicate that war is more likely. So that's some of the empirical evidence. I also want to talk briefly about a study by Doug Lemke that was published in the late 1970s, talked about analyzing the Cold War and the post-Cold War era under the prism of the power transition theory. So during the Cold War, according to his argument, and I also made that argument here, so that fits, the United States was the dominant power. The challenger was the Soviet Union. But according to the way that he described that, the Soviets never actually achieved parity. So that explains why we didn't have system-altering war during the Cold War. The reason that the Cold War ended was the failure of the Soviet system to sustain the competition with the United States, which led eventually to a change of objective. It led to conciliation in the form of democratization, privatization, and decreased military confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. Eventually, it led to the disintegration of the Soviet Union and to the structure we have today. I've mentioned briefly about the important role that internal growth plays in the accumulation of power by the challenger or the dominant state. According to Lemke, as part of his explanation to the Cold War and beyond the Cold War, there are three stages of internal growth. The first, there is an initial stage, which it's kind of slow. Then there is a transitional stage, which is very rapid. And then the third stage is what's called the power maturation, in which the powerful state now returns to a slower rate of growth. But in order to become a dominant state and challenge the status quo, states must reach and pass the second stage in this three-stage structure. And now coming back to the discussion about the Soviets in this context, is according to his argument, the Soviets were never really able to get past this second stage. And as a result, they decided to change path and go towards conciliation and the war. Now, looking at the global system after the Cold War, the vast majority of states are satisfied. Even Russia, not the Soviet Union, but Russia is fitting into the satisfied states. This paper was written during the 1990s. So at that point, the author identifies a couple of the nations which might be part of the dissatisfied states. So for example, China and Russia. But China and Russia at the same time might be dissatisfied with the international order, but they didn't have at the time enough power in order to challenge the structure of the international system led by the United States, which means back at the time, and actually it led all the way till today, there wasn't a war in the sense that the power transition theory has described it. Another way to think about it, if we think about the balance of power in Europe in the late 1990s and actually all the way through today, the power relations in Europe are similar in a way to the way it was before the First World War. There's multiple states, France, Germany, the United Kingdom also fits into that. There are different poles which have overall the same level of power, but the risk for war in this case, as I said, the balance of power is a risky proposition in the context of power transition theory. The reason that the balance of power in Europe that we have pretty much today as well is not a risk for war, because all those states are fitting within the satisfied states from the international order. So that's why, according to this argument, we should be less, that's part of the explanation why there's no large-scale war today. Okay, so that's power transition theory. Again, as a quick summary, and I'll have a full summary of all the structural theories at the end of the discussion today. Another international structural types of theory focusing on the interaction between states, mostly focusing on great powers, but instead of looking only at the concept of power and expansion of power or security, also talking about the level of satisfaction of the different nations with the existing international system, in order to explain the probability of war and explain their interactions. Also, one of the main differences, of course, is the fact that this theory rests on an international structure which is hierarchic and not anarchic. So that's another one. The last point I want to talk about is all those theories provide us explanation about the way that states behave. It's a very general level theory. How does one state behave because of structural conditions, right? Whether it is neorealism, whether it is the power transition theory, I talked about the security dilemma, all of these are very, abstract types of explanation. And the question that a simple person, even like myself, is going to say is, does all this dynamic actually materializes in reality? So in this case, is realism actually real? Do real people actually think in realist terms? So realist views are predominant in academic circles, of course. There's a lot of theories, realist theories, neorealist theories, everything I talked about so far. It also predominant in the policy making area with what's called the realpolitik, right? Countries that pursue their own interest. But it's not clear whether the public actually understands those perspectives. And there's some work on that, and some work suggests that the public is accepting those realist views. For example, public preference for using force in order to restrain aggressive behavior in the context of the United States, again, against Americans' interests. So the public supports the use of military force in order to restrain aggressive behavior, but it does not support the use of military force to promote internal political change. So that's fitting more to realism type of views. At the same time, some work suggests that Americans prefer the use of force mostly for humanitarian intervention and much less so to any kind of an aggressive action. So that does not fit with the realist point of view. So again, we have an inconsistent type of evidence regarding what exactly is the public view with this approaches of realist propositions. The challenge mostly is how to define this interpretation of realism in the public eye. So based on this research, which was published a few years ago by Kurtzer and McGraw, they defined it as what's called folk realism. So this is the public interpretation of realist views. They talked about different mechanisms that emphasize the public interpretation of realist arguments. And they focus on two mechanisms. The first is uncertainty, the level of uncertainty from a situation. Is that going to be the driver of my view of the situation, whether I actually think that we should engage in type of actions which are more fitting to the realist interpretation. Another one is fear. The puzzle in this case is whether invoking those kinds of mechanism of fear and uncertainty will actually lead the public to behave or to support actions that fitting with the realist perspective. Okay, so how did they exactly pursue this kind of puzzle and this kind of question? So the first thing that the authors did is looking at what's called the micro foundations of folk realism, whether it is a realist interpretation or a realist view is part of our belief system. And looking at that, looking at the micro foundation, look at the individual level characteristics and the individual traits that matter in this case. The authors begin by testing what they called is the information hypothesis, and that fits also to the uncertainty mechanism. A lack of information makes individuals more cautious and increase their tendency to behave in ways that fit with the realist perspective. So what I want to do is to show you, here it is, okay? So before going into their specific findings, I want to show you the kinds of questions they ask in order to understand whether people actually fitting more to the realist point of view or not. So for example, this is the questions that they asked their participants in their survey. So what's more important to you? So if you look at the first example in this case, is promoting human rights or improving security. And what you see in the parentheses here is the response to the second option in this question, which the second option fits more to the realist point of view. So in this case, you see that there's not necessarily too much of a realist majority for this kind of questions. We have here opening up trade with foreign countries or increasing military might. So actually here, the tendency is more to increasing trade than actually increasing military capabilities, which again, the second part of the question fits more with the realist interpretation. This is another set of questions that they ask. Here we have a question about war. So war usually occurs because different countries have different values, or it occurs because different countries have clashing interests, and the vast majority of respondents here actually took the more realist point of view. So there's different ways to measure this folk realism that the public has. This is just a general measure of that. And what they did is they looked at different individual traits that this respondents had and see how they fit with the more realistic interpretation of those kinds of options. So what they found is that conservatives are more likely to display a realist interpretation of the world. This also was mostly fitting with a higher degree of nationalism, higher degree of militarism, and isolationism. Sorry, those kinds of traits were more associated with realism. So people who are more conservative, who are more nationalist, are more likely to display those kinds of views. Those who exhibit high social and international trust are less likely to view those kinds of realist interpretation. People who display high degree of folk realism have a preference for conformity, social order, and social inequality, which is a little concerning on some level. And finally, they show that knowledge, even some level of political knowledge, is not correlated with any kind of those realistic views. So you don't have to be highly knowledgeable in the foreign policy affairs of the United States, of any other country for that matter, in order to display a realist point of view or a different point of view. Now, the second thing that they did, because this first task only measures the basic foundations of a realist point of view. What they wanted to check is whether this kind of foundation and this kind of view also matters for the different behaviors that individuals are displaying. So what they did is they used an experimental design in which they display different conflict scenarios, and they ask for whether the respondents of the survey support a type of action which fits again with the realist type of interpretation of the behavior. They focus on mechanism of uncertainty of the situation, as well as emotional reactions. The way they did that, they presented a set of examples, which I'm going to show you in a second. And they had conditions for more information, of less information, whether they provide background information on the conflict. And the second conditions that they have in this case was whether the conflict was a conflict that is more known for the American public, such as the conflict in Iraq, compared to a conflict in Central Asia in this case. So for example, this is one type of question that they had about the Sunnis and the Shiites in Iraq. And the question was, I'm going to focus here on the first, just to give you an example about behavioral, the type of behavior that realist or non-realist are supporting. So the Sunnis, the Shiite, and the Sunnis and Shiites have been fighting for many years. And the question is, the United States should deploy more forces in Iraq to help maintain a ceasefire between the two groups. So whether you want to engage in an action which fits with this kind of definition or not. So this is a list of examples. You can go and read the paper, or just look at my example here to see other examples for types of scenarios. What they find is that, first of all, individuals that displayed a higher degree of a folk realist view are tend to keep displaying those views even when they have less information about the situation. So even when they don't know a lot about a certain scenario, they're still likely to display those folk realist views. The second main finding they found is that a folk realist interpretation of the world, along with an emotional response, is very powerful. So high degree of fear made the folk realist disposition much more powerful in the respondents' view. So those who exhibit or felt a lot more fear due to this type of example, and we measure fear with different types of questions in our surveys, are even displayed even higher degree of a realist interpretation or realist preference for types of actions. So this is just, I wanted to present quickly this type of study to give you just a glimpse into the way that we can measure the way that the public actually has those the same interpretations of realism, the way that theories are, and in sometimes the way that policymakers also have. Overall, what the study shows is that folk realism is just an additional individual level dispositions that helps us structure our own views of the situations. Okay, so I want to finish with some summary about structural theories. So I talked today and on Tuesday at length about 3 of the central structural theories of international relations. Realism was on Tuesday mostly, neorealism was a little bit on Tuesday and some today, and power transition theories. Those theories has some common aspects between them. Mostly the international system is the main structure that determines the behavior of the different units, the different nations. They also share assumptions about rational behavior and the unitary actor. So you looking at the states as a unitary actor, not looking at the internal dynamics of the states. Military and economic powers are the main tools of statecraft according to those theories. At the same time, there are also clear differences between them. Between realism and neorealism, we saw the clear difference between the focus on power versus the focus on security. Those led to clear differences between the multipolar system and the bipolar system, how each one of those systems increases or reduces the risk of war based on the types of theory that you are adopting. And of course, we can add to that the power transition theory, which places focus on the control over the rules and the norms of the system. And it's a substantial deviation from the classic realist interpretation of the world. So that's some of the differences between them, and that's part of it. So that's the structural theories, that's the material theories. And if you want to read a little bit more, you're more than welcome to read those papers. I hope that you did not close the video yet. 2 things I want to do. First of all, the attendance word. The attendance word for today came in the last minute. That's going to be the word strong. Okay, so strong is the attendance word for today. Please send it to me afterwards. The second thing that I want to do now is talk about your midterm task. Okay. So the instructions of the midterm task is choosing one of the topics that we talked about starting from actually Tuesday when I started talking about the material theories all the way through week 7, which is going to be a week before the due date of this task. This is October 2nd at midnight. You're gonna submit this task using the assignments function on eCampus. I'm gonna give you some more instruction about that as we get closer to that. What you need to do in this task is provide a real world illustrations of some of those theoretical mechanisms, and I'm going to give you an example in a minute. That's the whole point of my stealing a few more minutes of your time at the end of today's lecture. And it's important, last thing, to do that. This is a task that you do by yourself. You don't do it with anybody else. Make sure that you do that. So let's look at an example. Let's say that I want to do the topic of power and international relations. What exactly is the task that I am expecting of, in this case, myself? Power as a defining factor of realist theory. So the first thing I have to do is to present in a page, maybe a little bit more than a page, the main arguments of the theory about the role of power within the realist theory. What are the main assumptions that relate to it? What is the expected system structure based on power? And then I will go around the internet, look for real world example, whether it is from the last couple of years, whether it is 10 years back, for how states engage in type of actions that fit with the realist point of view, especially focusing on power. When you find those examples, now I'm going to show you the example in a second, you will provide a brief paragraph, maybe a little bit more than a paragraph, describing the case itself, the real world case we're talking about, and then spend another paragraph explaining how the relevant behavior of those countries in this example that you chose represent or reflect power in the international system. And for that, let me stop sharing this screen for a minute and go to my web browser. So here is one example. This is the actions of Russia in the conflict in Ukraine. And the article here from the Atlantic Council describe various types of actions. In this case, it's mostly aggressive military actions that Russia has been engaged in Ukraine over the last 5-6 years. So this is one example for a realist type of action based on power. Russia wants to expand its power, expand its influence in the international system. And one way that it does is that engaging those kinds of actions with respect to Ukraine. We're also familiar with the last couple of years, the annexation of the Crimea Peninsula, which is related to Ukraine, of course. There's also evidence in this specific paper, in this specific article, about Russia interfering with cyber attacks in Ukraine. It's just part of the example. This is an example for an illustration of some of the concept behind the realist theory in using a real world example. And here is another one. The actions of both the United States and China in the South China Sea, both great powers, both actors that engage in actions that intend to expand their own power in this area. So this is another example. Again, give me a brief discussion about what is the case exactly, and then another brief discussion, how exactly are the actions of those nations reflect the concept of power in the international system, which again, this is the topic that I choose. You can choose, I gave the example of power because so far we talked mostly about those kinds of theories. By the time we get closer to the deadline to submit this midterm task, there's going to be additional theories, additional concepts they're going to introduce to you, and you can choose either one of them. If you have specific questions, of course, you're more than welcome to send me email and ask me, or just come up when we talk about when there is office hours, and we can talk about that. So we had a little longer lecture today. I hope you enjoy that, and I will see you all next week. Have a nice weekend and stay safe.